If you like to make your NFL games a little bit more interesting, you've come to the right place. It's the Even Money Podcast with Ross Tucker and Steve Fezzik.
Yeah, Vegas, baby, Vegas. It is the Even Money Podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings Sportsbook. Thank goodness for those guys. Make sure, by the way, no matter what it is that you're betting, use the code Ross. Should mention, with today's guest being the great Randy Moss from NBC and elsewhere, that you can get the DK Horse app to bet on the Preakness this weekend. I am Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman. Most of you know that. 5 teams, 7 years. It enabled me to get these cool broadcasting gigs. I've got this entire podcast network. I'm beyond excited for the NFL schedule release tomorrow night. If you didn't already, you need to listen or watch last week's Even Money episode where the great Steve Fezzik gave you all kinds of tips on how to bet the NFL schedule when it comes out. Although, as we're recording this, they're leaking games left and right. So at the end of the show, we'll get into that with Steve in terms of all these week 1 games we already know and should potentially bet. You can check me out on social media. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. The one and only Steve Fezzik is at Fezzik Sports and only at Fezzik Sports. And we are joined, as mentioned, by my longtime play-by-play partner, believe it or not. I don't know how long that was, but it was a great run when NBC Sports Network had Ivy League football. And in particular, on Friday nights, it would be me and my guy, Randy Moss. He'd have to hear all about Wyomissing and Pennsylvania high school football while we would have dinner the night before. Randy, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. Really appreciate it.
Hey, I'm writing this down. Use the code word Ross. Okay, I got that.
There you go. Code Ross, okay. DraftKings Sportsbook, the DK Horse app. Go for it. Yeah. And Randy, you were already in Baltimore ready for the Preakness this weekend.
Yep. You can see sort of almost looks like a picture on the wall, but the barn, the Preakness barn, that's the green barn, if you can see it right there behind me. I'm in the NBC trailer. I tried to get out there, but there's really no place to stand or sit or anything. So that's the best I can do, but I'm here. Yeah.
No, this is phenomenal. I absolutely love it. I think I've probably asked you this before, and Steve's here as well. I should probably say hi. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Hello, Princeton. Good.
So it's funny, Randy. Steve is like one of the most well-known bettors in the United States. He's fantastic. He's not a huge fan of betting on horse racing because he thinks it's really – I mean, Steve would be – I'm going to let you put it into your words, Steve. Steve would be the first one to tell you it's hard to win betting, period. He thinks that's especially the case in horse racing. Go ahead, Steve.
So the reason being is that in sports betting, when I make a bet, I lock in my odds. So if I play the Indiana Fever under 21.5 wins, which I did, it doesn't matter if they close 19.5. The closing number is irrelevant. I lock in my bet. And my biggest challenge with beating sports is that you correctly identify a horse that does indeed have value at 6-1, and they just tell you, the sportsbook tell you, well, the race book, well, we can't tell you what you're going to get. We'll let you know right after the race starts, and then you find out you're getting 4-1, and that's unacceptable to me. Not to mention the fact, imagine me trying to give out winners and betting big myself. If I give out winners, I'm actually costing myself money because my followers will drive the price down. Can't do it.
Yeah, so interesting. Go ahead, Randy.
We could talk about that for the entire podcast because that, horse racing is tinkering right now in some locations with what they refer to as fixed odds wagering. It would be the equivalent of European bookmakers offering a fixed price that doesn't change. You're locked in on that particular price. It hasn't spread yet throughout horse racing. There's been a financial issue trying to figure out, percentage that goes to purses and things like that. It's even more of a problem now, Steve. Because there is, with the advent of what's called computer-assisted wagering, right? I mean, you probably know all about that, CAW. Believe it or not, there are people with offshore accounts and now even U.S. accounts who have been given direct computer access into the betting pools. They have sophisticated programs with algorithms that go through all of the pools and look for mathematical inefficiencies that they can capitalize on, right? And they get their bets in at the last possible instant. And we see odds drops right now in horse racing. A horse can be 4-1 as they're loading in the gate. The race is off. The final flash, the horse could be 9-5. These people are betting hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They're absolutely dominating the pari-mutuel pools. And it's a big issue right now in thoroughbred racing that they're trying to figure out how to rectify. But it's going to be tough to rectify because they bet so much money that there's a financial incentive for the racetracks not to piss these people off, so to speak.
Wow. What do you think about that, Steve?
Seems like an unfair advantage, obviously, to those who are given that information. I always marvel at the fact, like when Randy said that, well, they're betting hundreds of thousands of dollars at post. Every dollar they bet on a combination they're playing, though, is costing them money. So, like, when they bet the first $10,000, then when they bet the second $10,000, it's cannibalizing the payout they're getting on the first $10,000. So you need a pretty advanced program. My understanding is these folks oftentimes are getting very attractive rebates as well to help them make money, too.
That's the key. That's the key. They're betting so much money that they can be rebated 8%, 10%, 12% on their money, especially offshore, because those offshore bet takers aren't affiliated with the racetrack and don't have to give purse money to the particular racetrack. So all these people need to do is basically break even on their wagers, and they can still make a nice profit on what they're putting through the windows.
You know, it's funny because, Randy, Steve and I do this every week, and it's a very popular podcast, especially during the NFL season. And the idea that Steve and I could give out our bets, and a lot of times the line does move or we get the better of the line, and then we have to accept whatever the line is. Like Steve's whole game, for the most part, is being ahead of where the line's going to end, right? And getting the better of the number. Right. But essentially in horse racing, it's impossible to get the better of the number, right? For a normal person.
The only exception is that if you do, and the Triple Crown races certainly apply, if on a sports book you bet horse-to-horse matchup bets in your sports book, you absolutely do lock in your price. So that's why I love the Triple Crown races. If you like one horse and you dislike another horse and they're paired against each other, which they oftentimes are in prop bets, that's a big moneymaker, and I fully endorse that.
What do you think about that, Randy?
Oh, yeah. I think the prop bets in horse racing are always extremely attractive. It's just, it's so much different from sports betting. In sports betting, it's you against the book. In horse racing and pari-mutuel betting, it's me against Ross. It's me against Steve, theoretically. Now, the takeout does make it more difficult to win, but if you're really immersed in the sport and you really have an advantage in deciphering all these things, it makes the odds a little bit more in your favor. That's the one thing that I like about it. But it's because I'm the one that's like immersed in everything.
And you, Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, you are allowed to bet, right? Even though you're a broadcaster, you are.
Oh, yeah. And I was in the newspaper business for 20 years before I spent the last 20 years as a broadcaster. And I was betting then, too. But I had an advantage then because I was basically at one racetrack, maybe, at a time. Typically in Arkansas or Louisiana or Texas. And I knew everything about those horses. I mean, I'd watch detailed videos on all the horses, made detailed notes. I had trainer notes. I had trip notes. I had everything. Trainers would call me and ask me what I thought about their horses' chances of winning. So from a wagering perspective, pari-mutuel, me against you, I had a nice advantage. And a partner and I made a lot of money betting the pick six back then. Now, today, I can be at Churchill Downs one week, Pimlico the next week, New York the next week, California, and I lose that advantage because now I'm betting head to head against those people that are at the track every day that know a lot more about the nuances than I do.
Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, spot on. Makes a lot of sense. If you just follow one track, you're going to do very well. I'll use an example like in baseball betting. Oftentimes you've got certain stadiums like Arizona. Is the roof going to be open or closed? The ball travels so much better when the roof's open. Well, if you live in Arizona and like you're friends with people in the stadium, you're going to get that information before anybody else. And so then you can benefit by betting. And of course, with the advantage of you bet the game over 8, it closes 9. And you don't get graded at 9, you get graded at 8. So focusing on one location, one team, one track makes a whole lot of sense to me.
And sometimes you can be, you can be a lot more familiar with, like you point out, the little nuances that that maybe others aren't. Even like, for example, when I just left college, I went to the University of Arkansas. And Nolan Richardson had just been hired as the head coach, I think from Tulsa to the University of Arkansas. This was before his national championships. And tragically, Nolan Richardson's daughter had leukemia. And she was fighting for her life, and he was away from the team for an extended period of time. He couldn't be focused on anything that was going on because obviously his daughter was his primary concern. And it sounds almost callous to talk about the spreads in this particular situation. But for that season, the University of Arkansas basketball team was absolutely horrible against the spread. And Vegas there were so many basketball games they got to make lines on, and they weren't really, I don't think they were tuned into that nuance. And, it sounds heartless that I made money betting against the coach whose daughter had leukemia. But, I would bet every week, every game. And I would take the opposing team, even though I was a staunch Razorback fan. And I made a lot of money just because I knew the little nuances of what was going on behind the scenes.
Wow, that's an interesting story, Randy. Almost as interesting as how delicious Labatt Blue Light is when I am crushing them with my friends and family while I'm watching horse racing or whatever. Living life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA. Buffalo, New York. One thing I think is interesting, Randy, is betting, I feel like, is a big part of the NFL, but it's extremely popular before you could bet on it. Whereas for horse racing, I don't know. I think it'd be weird almost. Like, what would be the level of interest in horse racing if you couldn't bet?
It would be polo. That's what it would be. It would be rich people running their horses against each other for the benefit of the rich people. It would be. You probably still have the Kentucky Derby, but it would be, it'd be a much, much different scenario.
Do you know people, Randy, that win betting like the Triple Crown? Is it really just these algorithm people, or do you know people that you kind of talked about how if you can just own one track and be all over it, you have an advantage. But people that bet, all these big races, do you know people that do pretty well with that, or is it really, really unable to do it unless you're, these people that have the sophisticated betting algorithms?
I know people who have made a living betting the horses, and not just betting the Triple Crown races and the props and things like that we're talking about. I'm talking about on a daily, weekly basis. There are not many of them, and it's not a good lifestyle at all. You have to have a certain type of personality to do that, because especially in horse racing, it's not a steady thing. It's up and down. You got to have the perseverance to endure the losing streaks with the confidence that you're going to turn things around. And it's almost like you never have a day off, because you're always because I've talked to him about this. You're always, wondering if you take a day away from the racetrack and away from your handicapping and away from your betting, there's that thought in the back of your mind, I might be missing the one score that can make a difference this month in my bottom line. It's not it's not a lifestyle that's conducive to family, really, and it's not a lifestyle I think is conducive to mental health. But there are people that do it.
Steve, does that sound familiar at all to you?
Absolutely. And so I'm getting outside my area of expertise, but like sports bettors, we chase promotions. And so, horse race, there are tracks that have carryovers, pick six carryovers. And so all of a sudden you've got it hasn't hit for a while and these bettors have been nice enough to be anting up their money. And now there's 500,000, that's thrown into the pool for a pick six. Right, Randy? And now all of a sudden you're like, I got to get me a piece of this, and I got to get heavily invested, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I used to do when I talked about being at a racetrack and focused on a racetrack, one racetrack in particular, and the advantages that inferred. That was the primary money-making vehicle, was playing the pick six when there was a substantial carryover. In our case, we waited until there was at least a six-figure carryover, because then you not only have the advantage of being at the racetrack and knowing everything about the horses, but then when the carryover gets that big, you get this sudden infusion of what we used to call dumb money. People that don't know anything about what's going on, but they thought, okay, big carryover pool, I got to bet. And they're putting in a lot of money.
So the sports betting equivalent, Ross, would be like when Circa has their Survivor or their Millions contest with a guarantee, and they're guaranteeing $10 million, and only 5 million worth of entries have signed up. And all of a sudden poker players come out of the woodwork, and they're like, well, golly, if I'm going to have a 40% overlay, I'm going to get me some of this NFL contest and I'm going to get into the pool. Yes.
Got it. Hey, Randy, I got to ask you this just because it was a big topic last week or the week before from a buddy of mine. I guess Jason Kelsey ruffled a bunch of feathers by suggesting that Secretariat was on steroids, and he just assumed Secretariat was on steroids because it was the 70s and Secretariat's heart was like 3 times the size of a normal horse. You've been in it for a long time. A, have you ever heard that? And B, why does that upsets? That's like talking bad about like Babe Ruth, right? Like that's like you just can't do that.
Yeah, it's like saying, Tom Brady was overrated, but look, there's no way to be able to prove anything. I've talked about this before. It's not a completely absurd idea. And here's another little piece of evidence. When Secretariat retired at the end of his 3-year-old year, and he was syndicated for $6 million, which in 1973 was a hell of a lot of money. You might have seen the movie Secretariat. It sort of like Save the Family Farm. When he was initially retired to stud, and they did the fertility tests, he was extremely subfertile. And then after a while, the fertility began to recover until finally he was okay. But that was a concern when he was first retired. And that is also a side effect of steroid use. And on top of it all, he was so much different looking than all the other horses basically that were around him. I mean, I wasn't around him in person back then in 1973 and 72, but talking to people, they said, even if you didn't know anything about horses at all, and you saw a group of 15, 20 racehorses, and you told somebody, one of those is Secretariat, pick them out, it'd be easy. Because he was such a statuesque physical specimen, compared to the other horses that he competed against.
Randy, let me ask you about Secretariat from memory, and I never saw the movie. I believe the Preakness was relatively close, and then he won the Belmont by like a football field. How is that possible?
Well, the Kentucky Derby, first of all, I'll be real quick about this because I know you guys want to talk about other things, but the big story in the Kentucky Derby, if we take them race by race, was Secretariat's sire was a horse named Bold Ruler, who was more of a miler than a 1.25 mile kind of horse. And there was concern that Secretariat would be able to get the 1.25 mile distance of the Kentucky Derby. In his race before, they stretched him out for the first time to 1.125 miles in the Wood Memorial, and he lost. And so that was a big storyline at Churchill Downs that week. And of course, he set a track record in the Kentucky Derby, 1:59 and 1/5 seconds, that to this day still stands. Then you go forward to the Preakness Stakes, and to be honest with you, he got a bad ride from Ron Turcotte. He was last going into the first turn. You can see the video on YouTube. And all of a sudden you see this blur on the outside, way, way too early. This is the first turn at Pimlico, and he goes from last to first. And yet he still managed to lead the rest of the way around. And then in the Belmont Stakes, he actually went too fast early. And they were really worried about it during the race. The trainer thought that the horse was beaten because he had set this absurdly fast pace. But the horse just kept running and kept running and kept running and set a world record for 1.5 miles on dirt. It's amazing that as all the other track records have gone by the wayside, because, we're talking 50 years of breeding, for more and more and more and more speed each generation. Secretariat still, to this day, has the track records in the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont.
Wow, that is wild. Randy, quickly, what do we need to know about the Preakness Saturday?
What do you need to know about? It's all about risk-reward, and the Kentucky Derby winner, Mystic Dan, had the most beautiful trip that a horse could possibly have in the Kentucky Derby. Now, he was good enough. He was handy enough. He had the acceleration to take advantage of that trip. And by that, I mean, he was on the inside all the way around, saved ground every step of the way, shot through a hole at the quarter pole. Whereas his primary competition in that race, Sierra Leone and the Japanese horse Forever Young, were way wide, losing momentum when they turned for home. And it still was the closest 3-horse photo finish in the history of the Derby. Just because of that, even though Mystic Dan is not going to be the favorite, he's probably still going to be overbet. Muth, who was trained by Bob Baffert, and Baffert, of course, was banned from the Kentucky Derby for the last 3 years. He's the 8-5 program favorite. There's not a lot of value there either. He's a legitimate favorite. He beat Mystic Dan the race before the Kentucky Derby pretty handily. But 8-5 is not a good price. There's a horse in there, though, called Tuscan Gold, who is trained by Chad Brown, who didn't run in the Kentucky Derby. He was a good third in the Louisiana Derby in his last start. And Chad has done this to great success before. Taking a horse who has a lot of talent, maybe he feels like he's not quite ready for the Kentucky Derby, skipping the Derby and waiting for the Preakness. He won the Preakness with a horse called Cloud Computing, same formula. Early Voting, same formula. Last year, he had just an average horse called Blazing Sevens, finished second in the Preakness, same formula. So I think Tuscan Gold probably, in my opinion, represents the best value of any horse in the Preakness.
Absolutely love it. Randy, thanks so much for the time. Thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Great to see you.
Hey, nice to see you, Ross. Take care, guys. Steve, enjoyed it.
All right. Obviously, Steve, we will dive into the entire NFL schedule next week. That's what we'll do. I'm trying to get our guy Warren Sharp on the show. But as these games keep getting released, right? Now we got Monday night is Niners-Jets. We know about opening night, Baltimore-Kansas City. We know about Dallas-Cleveland week 1. We even know about the Chiefs and the Bengals week 2. And DraftKings is putting up these lines. People can use code Ross. How are you attacking some of these week 1 matchups that are being released every couple of hours, it seems like?
Well, not a lot of attacking because the lines are pretty solid. However, Baltimore at Kansas City, I make that line 2.75. That's a thin edge. If you're going to bet it, Baltimore +3 at DraftKings looks somewhat attractive. I do think the wrong team's favored at DraftKings. Dallas, I think, should be a small favorite. You're getting +1 at DraftKings at Cleveland. So if you were going to bet that game, you want Dallas plus the points. I think you got an hour to do so. I think that Dallas is going to go off the favorite in that game. And I think San Fran, I make them a 6-point favorite against the Jets, so you can look for what number pops up on that game. That should be coming up today.
Got it. Wow, you are all over it. What about, Steve, WNBA? Any thoughts there quickly?
Blue Horseshoe hates the Indiana Fever, and Caitlin Clark, I bet a lot, under 21.5 and under 20.5. The best evidence I can give of what a good bet that is, Indiana's playing today. Indiana's a 7-point underdog to the Connecticut team. that's supposed to win 24.5 games. So think about it. Connecticut is only supposed to win 24, 25 games, and yet they're a 7-point favorite against Indiana. That means Indiana is not a 500 team, and thus Indiana to win under 20.5 in a 40-game schedule is indeed a solid bet.
Love it. Steve, you're the man. Thanks so much as always. Everybody else, good luck. Hope you guys win some money.
Thanks for tuning in to Even Money. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.